To understand one of the main arguments in favor of more people adopting insects into their diet, it's helpful to answer this question. Why do we not eat other humans? Human meat is technically edible, and cannibalism isn't just something from horror movies. Certain tribes around the world really did practice it at certain times. Apparently, humans taste like pork. But why is it really so rare? If you are what you eat, why do we not eat who we are? First, there is a health risk. Eating humans spreads disease. One such disease is kuru, which, like mad cow disease, is linked to infected brain and nervous tissue. The disease was discovered among a tribe in Papua New Guinea that practiced funerary cannibalism. The family of the deceased would eat their body in order to free the spirit and return their life force to the people. If the brain contained kuru prions, then whoever ate it would, after years or decades, get sick, with symptoms like tremors, uncontrollable laughter, and inevitably death. Once the tribe learned how kuru is spread, the practice of cannibalism there stopped, and kuru went away. The most obvious reason people don't eat each other is because it's illegal in most countries. Murder is bad. There's also the social cost. Nobody wants to be known as the neighborhood cannibal. Though I think if you are already eating human meat, then your reputation in the community is probably not something you are too concerned about. But why is this the case? War, genocide, and slavery all exist, so humans aren't shy about being horrible to each other. Yet throughout history, most cultures still didn't eat their prisoners or farm other people as food. Why? Human meat is unpopular worldwide for two main reasons. Out of all the meat on the planet, human meat is the least sustainable and the most empathy-generating. Empathy generation is easy to understand. We feel bad when we harm creatures that look like us. When we see other humans being physically harmed, most of us feel a certain sense of disgust or unhappiness, and that applies to seeing human corpses or body parts too. Seeing a dead mammal has similar effects, though not as strong. A dead fish, one of the most remote vertebrates from humans evolutionarily, probably not a very strong emotion. A boiled shrimp, even less so. And watching a farmer harvesting grain, a thresher machine mowing through the fields as sap and severed leaves fly everywhere, doesn't evoke any emotion at all. The more evolutionarily and physiologically distant an organism is from humans, the less empathy we feel for it and more comfortable we would be seeing it on a plate. As for sustainability, ask yourself this question. If you were farming humans, what would you feed them? And why not just eat that food yourself? Human farming makes no sense financially because you'd be spending more food feeding those humans than you could ever get from butchering them. Eating humans is inefficient. This goes back to why we eat animals at all. What do cows, sheep, and alpacas that we farm eat, or the deer and antelope that we hunt eat? They mostly eat grass, a plant which humans cannot digest. By herding livestock, especially in a pre-agrarian society, humans could convert all this grassland, this sea of inedible plant matter, into nutritious meat and milk. For pigs, we can feed them waste, vegetable peels, kitchen scraps, recycling nutrients we cannot process into a meat that we can. Meat exists as a way for humans to get more resources out of the plants that we grow or find, especially those we cannot eat ourselves. Farming humans defeats the purpose of farming at all. Farming most meat today involves feeding inedible plants like grass or hay to edible animals who convert them into edible nutrients. This is still inefficient. It would be more sustainable to grow edible plants and feed those to humans directly. This sums up the environmentalist argument for eating less vertebrate animal products and moving towards a more plant-based diet. Animal meat is not sustainable. With the growing realization that humanity's impact on the planet has led to destructive climate change, there is a global movement towards food that is better for the planet. At the same time, we need more food. By 2050, Earth's population is expected to have reached 9 billion people. That's a lot of mouths to feed. And they are eating more. When people get out of poverty, they expect to eat more food, and more nutritious food, and often more meat. In the 1960s, the average amount of calories a person ate each day was about 2,250. By 2050, it's expected to surpass 3,000, and a lot of this is due to increasing demand for meat. Global meat consumption doubled between 1970 and 2013, and is expected to increase another 60% by 2050. Food production needs to increase by 70% by 2050 in order to feed all these people. Yet the amount of arable land on the planet is limited. The amount of fresh water available to irrigate our crops isn't going up. Finally, as growing populations move increasingly to cities, the amount of actual farmers making this food is going down. We need to make more food, and we need to do it in a way that uses as little land, water, and resources as possible, all while producing as little waste and greenhouse gases as possible. Why is meat so bad? The key term is conversion ratio, the amount of feed given to these animals divided by the amount of food you derive from them. The lower the ratio, the more efficient the animal, because you get more product for less resources. Plants are very efficient. All they need is air, water, and sunlight, and you get plenty of food. For animals, you will always put in more feed than the amount of food you get back, because some of those calories they eat will be burned just to keep the animal alive. For warm-blooded animals like mammals and birds, which happen to be the majority of the animals that we farm and eat, the conversion ratio is very high because the majority of the calories they consume will be burned just to keep their body temperature the same. Less than half of the calories eaten will be used for moving, thinking, and building meat. And that doesn't include all the calories pooped out because herbivorous animals don't digest all of the food they consume. Then, you need to calculate all the inedible parts of the animal: bones, skin, feathers, beaks. In short, most of the feed you give a cow, pig, or chicken will be burned as heat or used to make organs humans cannot consume, in effect wasting it. Because the conversion ratio is high, a lot of resources are needed to make meat. That means we need to farm crops specifically to give to the animals that we eat. Alfalfa, soy, hay, corn. A lot of the crops humans grow aren't grown for human consumption, but as animal feed. This requires lots of resources: labor, fertilizer, tractors, fuel for the tractors, fuel for the trucks taking the feed to the livestock pens, etc. It also requires a lot of water. The water required to produce meat not only includes what you give the animal to drink, but also what you use to grow its feed. The land used to grow these feed crops is also part of the cost. A growing population and growing demand for meat mean a growing demand for land, and forests worldwide are being cut down to grow crops for animal feed. All these resources, the land, the water, the labor, could have been used to grow food for humans: potatoes, rice, wheat, and grow it more efficiently. With limited resources, this actually drives up costs for all food, while meat is still more expensive than plant-based protein. On top of it all, there's the waste. Cow manure is a huge amount of waste. Where do you put all of it? Use it as fertilizer? You can't just dump it. It's loaded with microbes and toxins. It can contaminate the drinking water. And what about the bones, the feathers of chickens? This is a sizable amount of waste, and eliminating waste costs money and has environmental cost. Finally, the greenhouse gases. All animals produce carbon dioxide gas, but ruminants like beef and lamb are particularly problematic. The microbes in their gut that help them digest their rather poorly digestible food produce methane, a potent greenhouse gas. Cow manure, when it degrades, releases methane and nitrous oxide, another potent greenhouse gas. These two sources account for nearly 6% of all greenhouse gas emission worldwide, and that doesn't include the carbon footprint of the feed crops. From every point in the supply chain, energy is burned and emissions are produced. As popular as meat is, and its popularity globally is still rising, its effects on the planet are overwhelmingly negative. And some people are starting to notice. If you calculate a conversion ratio of feed given to edible matter produced, you see that not all meat is created equal. Statistics vary somewhat depending on the source, but for beef production you need from 6 to 10 kilograms of feed to make just 1 kilogram of cow, and much of that is inedible mass like bone. The conversion ratio for beef typically ranges from 25 to 30 kilograms of feed for every kilogram of pure protein. Not kilogram of meat, but pure protein. For pork it's under 10 kilogram, for poultry and farm fish under 5, for crickets and mealworms, the most commonly farmed insects, between 1.5 to just over 2. For every kilogram of feed you give insects, you get about half a kilo of protein back in return, while for beef you'd get less than 40 grams. By the way, all that feed doesn't become meat. Especially for cows, a lot of that becomes poop. The more efficient the conversion ratio, the less feces you can expect to see as well. Why are insects so efficient? Insects are cold-blooded. They don't need to burn calories to maintain their body temperature. They match whatever the temperature is outside. And insects also don't have bones. Typically, when you eat insects, you eat the entire thing, from tip to tail, or antenna to abdomen. For insects that are gutted before eating, or with harder exoskeletons that are not completely digestible, you're looking at least 80% of animal that is edible. For softer-bodied insects like mealworms, 100% is edible. Compare this to a cow. After steer weight becomes carcass weight, becomes retail cuts, only about 40% of the actual animal will ever end up on someone's plate. Very wasteful. In every metric, farmed insects outperform traditional livestock. Insects require less water than traditional livestock. Part of that is because they require less feed, which means fewer plants have to be grown to feed them. Another part is they drink much less water. Insects don't sweat, they don't lose nearly as much moisture when they breathe, the way mammals do, and without going into details, they don't pee liquid urine, which means they don't need to drink water to excrete waste as we do. For land, not only do insects require far less land than other animals in terms of what is used to grow their feed, but also they themselves need far less space. Keeping cattle or pigs in confined spaces, which is unfortunately done in factory farms, is not great for the animals and means a lot of waste is concentrated in one area, producing nitrous oxide and fouling up the environment. Insects like mealworms prefer being in close quarters. They thrive in it. And because insects are so small, you can farm them vertically. Stacks of insect boxes, one on top of the other. You couldn't do that for cows. In terms of greenhouse gases, again, because insects require so few resources relative to what they produce, their carbon footprint is very low. Cows and sheep literally belch and fart out hundreds of kilos of carbon dioxide equivalent greenhouse gases for every 1 kilogram of protein because of their enteric fermentation. For insects, it's almost 2 orders of magnitude less. For these reasons, we have seen renewed attention given to edible insects in the 21st century. In particular, a document produced by the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations in 2013 entitled Edible Insects: Future Prospects for Food and Feed Security laid out the idea that would become the basis of most edible insect activism since, that insects are the most sustainable option for animal protein that can be produced in large enough amounts to feed our growing population. Hence the idea, exaggerated or not, that you can save the world by eating insects. Or at least by eating less beef or lamb. When it comes to farmed animals, clearly insects are the winner in terms of sustainability, by a large margin. But meat is not the only source of protein. What about alternatives? Sticking to animal protein, while dairy and eggs are superior to beef and poultry meat respectively, they still aren't as sustainable as insects. Another futuristic alternative is cell-based cultured meat, or in vitro meat, real animal meat that's grown in a laboratory rather than as a living organism. It's real meat. The way you cook it and the way it tastes is indistinguishable from the butchered version, but its production still requires resources, including water and electricity. It's currently expensive, and its conversion ratio is only around 4, an improvement over beef, but equivalent to fish. Until the technology improves considerably, insects still have an edge. Since any animal will require feed, all animals, including insects, will have some land, water, and carbon footprints. What about mushrooms? Like animals, fungi consume nutrients and produce CO2, but they do this in far lower amounts than animals do. And since plants take in carbon dioxide when they photosynthesize, they should have a negative carbon footprint, right? Well, not exactly. Intensive agriculture still requires fertilizer, energy for tractors and other machines, and most importantly, land. Land that would otherwise have been a forest or other area that more actively absorbs carbon. This land use change is part of the carbon footprint of agriculture. There's no such thing as a completely carbon-free diet. Now, the exact calculations depend on whether you are looking at whole grains or processed plant products like tempeh or tofu, all of which have different percent proteins by weight. Still, the impact of plant proteins is quite small, and depending on the food, lower than for insects. If you want to minimize your carbon footprint as much as possible, the best diet is still most likely a vegan diet. For land use too, some publications conclude that farmed insects actually require less land per unit of protein than plants, while others found them to be more or less equal. One study found that if all humanity were to replace 50% of their current animal products with insect protein, we would get a 34% global reduction in the amount of land needed for agriculture. Replace it with soy, you get 35%. Those are both excellent reductions, though neither is realistic given current trends in diet. Ideally, people would just eat less food, maybe fight obesity and climate change at the same time, but that doesn't seem to be the path humanity is following. An important caveat to all of this is that we are looking at farmed insects, which are fed a feed grown specifically for them to eat, typically made from corn or other grains. The math changes significantly when we look at insects used in bioconversion, feeding insects to waste from other forms of agriculture and using those insects as food or even as feed themselves. Organic side streams from other food production industries like vegetable peels or rice husks, cow manure, chicken feathers, soybean pods, corn stalks. If these are fed to insects, you're not only getting their feed almost for free, but also you are bringing down the carbon and resource footprints of the other foods accordingly by recovering lost nutrients and maximizing the amount of protein you get from the same inputs, and reducing waste buildup and carbon production from microbial degradation. We will discuss bioconversion in more detail later, but when you run the calculations, protein from insects-fed organic side streams or waste is more sustainable, requiring less land and less water, even compared to plants. Let's talk about nutrition. The nutrients necessary for life are proteins, fats, carbohydrates, vitamins, minerals, and water. Yes, water is a nutrient, though you probably have a good idea of how to get water in your diet. Hint: drink water. We'll start with protein. Proteins are the building blocks of life. Most of what makes you, you, are proteins. There are millions of different proteins in nature, but all of them are made up of the same basic components called amino acids. There are 22 proteinogenic amino acids in all life, one of which is only used in a few single-celled microbes, so there are 21 used to make all the proteins in humans, animals, plants, mushrooms, etc. From these, only 9 are essential amino acids, meaning you must get these from your diet. The other non-essential amino acids can be generated from the essential ones by your body itself. Most food you eat, plant or animal, will contain proteins. But not all foods contain all 9 of the essential amino acids. Nutritionists define complete protein sources as those which contain all the essential amino acids. All animal protein, including milk and eggs, is complete, as are a few plant proteins like soy and quinoa. Insects are animals, so insects are complete proteins. Most plant-based foods are incomplete proteins, meaning they are lacking in certain essential amino acids, but by combining 2 different complementary incomplete proteins together, one can still get all essential amino acids. However, not all proteins are equally digestible. Hair, for example, is a protein called keratin, which the human body cannot digest. It is impossible to derive any nutrition from keratin. Any hair you eat will pass right through your digestive system and emerge from your anus looking exactly the same as it did when it was swallowed, if you're lucky and it doesn't get stuck in your gut. Keratin is also the main component of fingernails, animal claws, feathers, and horn, including rhino horn. A traditional Chinese medicine, rhino horn is 100% identical to hair and fingernails with absolutely no possible health effects on the human body. You might as well eat your own fingernails. To account for digestibility, protein quality is measured as the protein digestibility corrected amino acid score, which is the ratio of essential, digestible amino acids in a protein. Keratin has all the essential amino acids, but it is indigestible, so its score is 0. Incomplete proteins like grains, fruit, and vegetables have scores between 0.5 to 0.8, as would animal proteins that are partially indigestible. While complete animal proteins and soy have scores from 0.9 to 1, 1 being a complete protein source that is completely digestible. On this scale, insect proteins fare very well. Soft-bodied insects like silkworm pupae and fly larvae are high-quality proteins, as nutritious as milk, eggs, and meat. Insects with a hard exoskeleton like crickets, while still complete proteins, are scaled with vegetables and grains because some of this protein is not digestible. The reason for this is that some of the protein is locked in the hard exoskeleton of insects, which is made of protein interwoven with a polysaccharide called chitin. Chitin is thus a carbohydrate. It's made of sugars chained together, just like starch. Carbohydrates are what your body burns for energy. However, just as some proteins are not digestible, certain carbohydrates cannot be digested. However, unlike keratin, these indigestible carbohydrates are beneficial for your health. They are called fiber. You may have heard that you need fiber in your diet to help move food through your digestive system. The most common sources of fiber are indigestible plant polysaccharides like cellulose and pectin, which are found in the cell walls of every plant. Fiber can be soluble like pectin, meaning it dissolves in water and forms a gel that slows down digestion. Or insoluble like cellulose, meaning it adds bulk to stool and helps push it through your gut. Chitin, found both in exoskeletons and in the cell walls of fungi like mushrooms, works similarly to cellulose. You can't digest it, but it does help push food through your gut and is thus good for you if consumed in reasonable amounts. So if you're eating shrimp, don't peel them. That shell contains extra fiber. What about fat? You do need fats or lipids in your diet, but in relatively small amounts compared to protein and carbs. Lipids are made of fatty acids, which, like amino acids, are divided into essential and unessential. It's very rare to have a fatty acid deficiency. A small amount of plant oils is all you need to get all the essential fatty acids necessary to survive, and if you're eating animal protein, you are definitely getting more than your minimum daily requirement of fat. Getting enough fat isn't a problem for most people. Not getting too much of fat is another matter. Fatty acids come in different types based on their molecular bonds. Without going too much into the biochemistry, if all the carbon bonds in the fatty acid are single bonds, it's a saturated fat. If there are double bonds, it's an unsaturated fat. Unsaturated fats can be mono or polyunsaturated if they have one or more than one double bond, respectively. Unsaturated fats can be further divided into cis and trans fats, the latter of which are considered quite toxic but which aren't commonly found in nature and so not worth mentioning further. Which of these fats is a good fat? Well, that depends on what decade it is. The definitions of good and bad fats keep changing. Saturated fats, which are typically found in red meats, were once thought to be bad for your health. They're now considered to be neutral. Within the polyunsaturated fats are certain fatty acids called omega-6 and omega-3, which were once thought to prevent heart disease, but which we now think have almost no effect on your health at all. We know that people whose diets are lower in red meats are less likely to get heart disease, but this benefit seems to be less due to the types of fats they consume and more due to simply eating less fat overall. And all of this may change with more research over time. So what fats are in insects? Well, it depends on the insect. Some, like crickets and termites, are mostly protein, while others, like beetle larvae, are mostly fat. You can tell that from looking at them. Insects are less than 40% saturated fat, which by most metrics is pretty healthful. Aquatic insects have more polyunsaturated fats than terrestrial insects, which gives them more of a fishy taste, but allegedly makes them a little healthier. The biggest point is that insects are not a lean meat, and can be quite high in fat. If your goal is to lose weight, insects are not the ideal protein source for you. However, if one can separate the fats from the proteins through processing, then whole insects can be turned into two products: insect oil that can be used for cooking, and insect powder containing protein and chitin. But that's another story. What about the micronutrients, vitamins and minerals? These are essential to surviving and thriving, though needed in smaller amounts compared to the macronutrients of protein, carbs, and fats. Most of these you get from plants, so a diet with a diverse variety of fruits and vegetables will provide you with much of the vitamins and minerals you need. Important exceptions are vitamin D, most of which your body makes by itself from exposure to sunlight, and vitamin B12, which is found in animal proteins but not found in plants. Vegans are typically at high risk of B12 deficiency and are encouraged to take supplements. Insects contain B12 and so could be used to supplement an otherwise plant-based diet. They're also relatively high in B1, thiamine, B2, riboflavin, and B3, niacin, though these are also available from plants. Insects are very diverse, so different species have vitamins in different ratios. From the essential minerals, there are 5 major minerals and 10 trace minerals, plus chlorine, which is found bound with sodium and table salt, and fluorine, which is beneficial but not essential. The mineral most associated with meat is iron, and insects have lots of it. 100 grams of insects have more iron than 100 grams of beef, making them particularly excellent for children and mothers with anemia. Insects also provide your daily requirements of copper, magnesium, phosphorus, and zinc, and often have enough manganese and potassium too. Insect levels of calcium seem to depend on the species, as sources vary whether they are high or low in this. With all of this information, what food group would you place insects in, and where do they belong in your diet? Like most animal foods, insects are low in carbohydrates and high in protein and fat, and are good sources of vitamin B12 and the minerals not found in staple plants. Their chitin levels mean that, unlike most proteins, they provide dietary fiber. But eating whole insects for fiber would provide you with a lot more fat than necessary. Where insects belong in your diet depends on you. If you are a well-off person in the developed world, in a country where obesity is more common than malnutrition, you probably don't need any more protein and fat in your diet. However, in the developing world, and especially in communities where malnutrition is common, particularly among children, adding insects to the diet could be the difference between life and death. As a source of protein and important micronutrients like zinc, insects can play a major role in the nutrition of certain communities. Coupled with the fact that insect farming is easier in impoverished communities than farming mammals, but that too is another story. A question many people have about insects, or any other food that is unfamiliar to them, is it safe? Are there any potential risks from eating insects that we don't yet know? First of all, while insects may be a novel food to you, they are not new to humanity. Humans have been eating insects for thousands of years. As a species, we've been harvesting and collecting wild insects as food for as long as we have existed. Long before we began farming crops, long before we domesticated animals, if there are any risks to eating insects, we already know them. The chance that insects will someday be discovered to be dangerous is quite low. That is not to say insects are risk-free. Like any food, both plant and animal-based, insect food can become contaminated with pathogens, germs that cause you to be sick, causing food poisoning. Again, this has nothing whatsoever to do with insects. All food in the universe has the potential to cause food poisoning if it gets contaminated, especially if eaten raw. Maybe a farmer didn't wash their hands after using the toilet and got fecal bacteria on their crops. Maybe the contamination happened in storage, or maybe you left the food out of the refrigerator for too long. Food poisoning can happen anytime to any food. The rules for insects are the same as for every other food. Store it properly, in the refrigerator or freezer if possible, and cook it thoroughly. Boiling or frying food for at least 5 minutes should kill most disease-causing bacteria. Are there any risks specific to insects? Well, certain insects are poisonous, just like certain plants, and are not edible. These include certain rove beetles, blister beetles, and tussock moth caterpillars, which produce irritating chemicals that harm your skin if touched. Scorpion sting venom can be absorbed in the mouth, which is why the stinger is usually removed before eating them, though cooking also deactivates the toxins. While mealworm larvae are very much edible, the adults produce carcinogenic quinones and should not be eaten. If you're trapped on a desert island with no source of protein but insects, avoid fuzzy caterpillars and anything with bright coloration, and instead stick to crickets and grasshoppers that are most often safe. As with other animals, insects can pick up pathogens or toxins from the food that they eat. Insects that scavenge on dead things could pick up germs from the food. Wild-caught insects could contain heavy metals or pesticides. The tobacco hornworm, if fed on tobacco, will accumulate nicotine, and eating them can make you sick, like eating a cigarette. Insects are gluten-free, but if you feed an insect wheat, then it could have gluten in it, which is bad for people with celiac disease. There are ways to deal with these when preparing wild-collected insects, like gutting them and cooking them thoroughly. And for farmed insects, the solution is to simply not give them contaminated feed. Keeping insect feed dry to prevent mold from growing, and keeping potentially dangerous animal tissue out of the food supply will ensure farmed insects are safe. The biggest fear is mad cow disease, caused by infectious proteins called prions. It's spread by eating contaminated brain or nervous tissue from infected cows. While there are no prion diseases in insects, and insects cannot get mad cow disease, for now it is safest not to use cow tissue as feed for animals, including insects. This is not an issue for herbivorous insects like crickets and mealworms, but does apply to soldier flies, to be discussed later. What about new diseases that can jump from animals to humans? History is filled with such examples, where close contact between humans and animals led to the evolution of a mutated strain of an animal pathogen that could infect people too. AIDS is a good example. The virus responsible, HIV, is related to SIV, which causes illness in apes, and is thought to have first spread to humans through the butchering of ape meat for food. Most of these diseases originated in mammals. The likelihood of a zoonotic disease jumping from edible insects to humans is rare, simply because our bodies and insect bodies are too different. There are zoonoses associated with insects, namely diseases like malaria, yellow fever, and dengue vectored by mosquitoes. But you need to be bitten by the mosquito to get sick. Eating a mosquito will not infect you. The only zoonoses spread through eating insects are typhus, found in body lice, and tapeworms in fleas. Neither of these insects are very appetizing, so hopefully that won't be a problem. There is, however, one important risk that is common to all insects: allergies. An allergy is an abnormally strong reaction to a normally harmless protein, with symptoms including a rash, runny nose, swelling, difficulty breathing, and in the worst case, anaphylactic shock that could be fatal. One of the most common food allergies is allergy to crustaceans, such as crabs or shrimp, which is often traced to proteins that are also found in mollusks, insects, and mites. If you know you have a shellfish allergy, then I'm afraid you are likely to also be allergic to insects and may want to avoid them. Note that it is entirely possible to only be allergic to crustaceans, or only allergic to insects, or even certain types of insects. And note that food allergies can develop over time. You won't know until you try, and allergy to insects probably is not common. Still, if you eat insects and develop symptoms of a food allergy, then I'm afraid you are allergic, and your adventures in entomology are at an end. While your health and nutritional needs may place certain restrictions on your diet, your faith can place other restrictions. Many religions have prohibitions on what people can and cannot eat, for various reasons. Some religions argue against eating animal products in general, namely the religions that originated from India. Jainism generally requires vegetarianism for its practitioners, as a means of practicing non-violence, or ahimsa. Hinduism is also associated with ahimsa, and around 1/3 of Hindus in India are vegetarian. Certain schools of Buddhism, such as Mahayana, recommend vegetarianism, while the Theravada school does not explicitly do so. Chinese Buddhist tradition involves vegetarianism, as well as the avoidance of certain strong-smelling vegetables like onion and garlic. Sikhs may or may not be vegetarian depending on their interpretation of the religion, though those that eat meat typically eat meat slaughtered in the Jatka way, typically with one swift cutting motion to sever the head from the body. Eating insects would be prohibited in most of these faiths that prevent the taking of animal life for food. This is not to say that there are no edible insects in India. By contrast, Northeast India has a rich history of entomophagy, especially in the rural Northeast. Among the Abrahamic religions, both Judaism and Islam have particular rules for how animals are to be slaughtered, both requiring a swift, uninterrupted cut to the neck and a prayer to God at the start of the process. However, while vegetarianism is not required for these religions, both prohibit certain animals from being eaten as they are considered unclean. Pigs are a famous example of an animal that both Jews and Muslims are encouraged to avoid, but so are most insects. In the Hebrew Bible, flying creeping things and multi-legged creatures that crawl on the ground are considered unclean, but exceptions are made for certain creatures identified as swarming locusts. Biblical scholars, together with entomologists, have tried to determine which exact species of locusts the Bible is referring to. While different rabbinical schools and traditions disagree, the migratory locust Locusta migratoria and desert locust Schistocerca gregaria are generally seen as kosher, while other insects, including other Orthoptera, are not. While locust farming is trickier than farming the more popular cricket, locust farms do exist in Israel today to bring edible insects to the observant Jewish market. In the Quran, insects are never explicitly mentioned as forbidden, so different Muslim scholars have reached different conclusions based on different hadiths on which insects are permissible as food and which are haram or forbidden. Some hadiths mention the Prophet Muhammad eating locusts while on the Hajj pilgrimage, and encouraging others to eat them too. Others quote him as saying he neither eats them nor declares them unlawful. Whether a certain insect is halal or not thus depends on one's particular branch of Islam, and different Islamic jurists have issued different rulings on what can and cannot be eaten. Hanafis forbid all insects, Malikis approve all insects, and other scholars say it depends. If an insect accidentally falls into your food, can you eat it, or did it have to be slaughtered specifically as food, and if so, are there certain methods of slaughter that are required? If you are concerned, check with the relevant authorities in your area to see what is locally acceptable. From the other Abrahamic religions, Druze and Samaritans have similar dietary restrictions to Muslims and Jews, while Christians and Baha'i do not. Any animal can be eaten as long as it is safe and nutritious. In fact, in the Christian Bible, John the Baptist is first introduced as surviving on a diet of locusts and honey. Why does locust appear so frequently in these texts? Why do they get a pass? Physiologically, there is little difference between many of the grasshopper species related to the migrating locusts, to say nothing of crickets and katydids that are also orthoptera but typically not considered kosher or halal. The answer lies in practicality. From North Africa to the Middle East and onwards to Central Asia, swarms of locusts have always been, and still are, a seasonal problem. Plagues of locusts can devastate cropland and eat everything in their path, leaving nothing remotely edible behind. If your religion told you not to eat locusts, and a swarm came and ate everything else, you would either starve to death or switch fates. Besides environmental, health, or religious reasons, a reason many people give for eating less meat is empathy. They feel bad that animals have to suffer or die for human pleasure. But this empathy is almost never applied evenly to all animals. Philosophy has the concept of moral status. If something has moral status, then humans have a moral obligation to it, and must respect its rights. Your fellow humans obviously have moral status. Inanimate objects like paper and pencils do not. But which living things have moral status? Before you say all lives matter, remember that your own immune system kills millions of microbes every second. Bacteria do not have moral status. So if you were to draw a line on the evolutionary tree of life where you believe moral status starts, where would you draw it? If you were an ascetic follower of a strict Jainist sect, bacteria is probably as far as you will go. While not all Jainists do this, the most extremely nonviolent ones go beyond being vegan. They will try to minimize harm even to plants. They won't eat root vegetables because the act of washing the dirt off can disrupt small organisms that live in the soil, or because harvesting the root kills the plant. They won't practice agriculture because tilling the soil is violence upon the earth. Some will wear face masks at all times to avoid accidentally breathing in insects, and carry brooms to sweep the earth in front of them so they will not step accidentally on anything. To a Jainist, any life, even microscopic life, has moral status. It's certainly an extreme lifestyle and not a popular one, but easily the most ethical. For the rest of you, where do you draw the line? Some extreme vegans, like fruitarians, draw it somewhere in the plants. Fruits and other parts of the plant that fall off the main body are edible, but anything that involves cutting or killing the plant is too violent. For animals, most people will draw a line somewhere between those that are pets and those that are food. These lines are not drawn in the same place worldwide. Pigs, rabbits, and ducks can all be kept as pets, yet they are also widely eaten. Guinea pigs are pets in much of the world, edible cuy in Peru. Cows are food for much of the world, yet in Taiwan, people in farming communities typically will not eat beef, because oxen are seen as friendly animals that pull plows and help with farm work. Oxen have moral status, while lazy chickens and pigs do not. And what about insects? A vegan may refuse to eat insects, but if a mosquito were to land on them and suck their blood, would they kill it? If they see a cockroach in their house, would they step on it? The cockroach did nothing wrong. Why does it deserve to die? Honeybees are certainly helpful to humans. Their larvae and pupae are edible. and indeed eaten in parts of the world? Do bees, butterflies, and other pollinators have moral status, while non-pollinating crickets and cockroaches do not? Where do you draw the line? There is no right or wrong answer to this. Ethics is subjective. What I can say with certainty is that even though you may have never thought about it, you definitely draw the line somewhere. If you were to ask someone why they draw the line between organisms with moral status and organisms without, where they do, they might bring up questions of pain, suffering, and consciousness. These topics deserve a course of their own, so I can only give you a brief overview here. Let's start with pain. Pain is the physical sensation that the body is being damaged. In humans, we have special pain receptors called nociceptors that can sense if the body has been harmed. They can tell if the skin is cut or burned or being pressed too hard. If your bone broke, your nociceptors tell you sense pain. If germs or parasites are harming your gut, your nociceptors tell you sense a stomachache. Nociceptors are important because if you are being damaged, you need to react to get out of harm's way. Some of this is for immediate protection, some long-term. If you were to walk on a broken leg, it wouldn't heal properly, and you may spend the rest of your days disabled. The pain you feel when injured causes you to stay immobile, to rest, so that you can heal properly and have more healthy years ahead of you. Pain is distinct from suffering. Nociception is physical, suffering is mental. Suffering is the conscious sensation of pain and its interpretation into something negative. Pain sensation requires nociceptors, while suffering requires a central nervous system. Suffering requires a brain. You can have pain without suffering. People on opioid painkillers will tell you that they feel pain, they just aren't bothered by it. You can also suffer without nociception. Hunger, thirst, heartache, fear, boredom, injustice, ennui. There are many forms of suffering for an advanced life form like a human, and not all of them physical. This also means that your behavior in response to pain may not necessarily be due to suffering. It could be a reflex. When you touch something hot and burn your hand, you move your hand away immediately, before you even realize that you were in pain. Other reflexes include screaming, groaning, crying, wincing. Your physical expressions of pain aren't a sign that you are suffering. They are automatic, unconscious responses to pain. We know this from decorticate humans, people who, often from severe injury, are missing the part of their brain that houses their consciousness. People in such a vegetative state cannot suffer emotionally, but still react to pain physically. Do insects have nociceptors? Yes, they do. Their nociceptor genes are not too different from ours. Insects can definitely sense pain. If you cut an insect, it will react. If you poke it with a hot probe, it will react. And these pain responses, or nociceptive reflexes, are different from a deliberate movement of the insect. However, insect nociception does differ from humans' somewhat. First of all, unlike humans, insects do not have internal, visceral nociceptors. They have no way to detect damage inside of the body. Insects physically cannot get stomach aches or heartaches or muscle aches. Lucky. This explains how insects can have parasitic worms or parasitoid wasp larvae living inside of them, eating their organs, and not behave differently. They don't notice. They can't. Unlucky. Next, insects seem unable to detect damage that has already been done. I gave the example of a broken leg. In humans, this would be painful, and you would have trouble walking without at least a limp. Experiments show that if you break an insect's leg, they will feel the initial break. But afterwards, they seem to walk with the same amount of weight on that leg as before, something unthinkable in humans. Another example, praying mantis males will sometimes continue to mate with a female, even while the female is cannibalizing them, eating them alive. Most humans will refuse to mate if they have so much as a headache. Insect behavior does not match our understanding of pain perception or suffering. How is this possible? Why would insects not evolve the ability to sense broken limbs or internal parasites? The answer is they don't have time for it. The insect lifespan is short, and at any moment a predator could eat them, or a large animal could squish them. In the few weeks, days, or even minutes of their adult life, they need to find a mate and reproduce at least once, maybe find food too. If an insect were to stop for a few days and rest, waiting for a broken leg to heal, it will be dead before it has a chance to get better. Insects don't have time for pain. A human, meanwhile, has a long lifespan. If you break your leg, you can certainly afford to take a few weeks out of your decades-long lifespan to heal and still have plenty of years left to mate and reproduce afterwards if you are so inclined. Nociception helps us maintain our bodies for the long term. For insects, it would be an unaffordable distraction. I must note here that more recent research does suggest insects can experience chronic nerve pain. For now, consider this area of science still under debate. To summarize, insects can sense some forms of pain, especially acute pain from physical damage or high temperature. If you were to toss a live insect into a frying pan, it will feel that heat as pain. Briefly. But will it suffer? Insects do have brains, but are these brains capable of having an emotional response to physical damage? Or even having emotions at all? Most animal rights and animal welfare activists agree that if an animal is conscious, sentient, capable of feeling, perceiving, experiencing, then it has moral status. Killing it or causing it to suffer may be unethical. By the same token, if something is not conscious, like an inanimate object, then it has no moral status. The hard part is agreeing whether an animal is conscious or not. In 1974, Thomas Nagel wrote an influential essay called "What is it like to be a bat?" He asks, if you could have the subjective experience of a bat, what would you experience? You wouldn't have human thoughts, because you're now a bat, with a bat brain, not a human one. Your senses are different, your emotions are different, your ability to think will be different. You will be conscious, but it will be a bat consciousness, a bat experience. It may be completely unlike anything humans can even conceive. And many emotions and experiences humans take for granted, ambition, fun, love, faith, guilt, curiosity, may not be there at all. The question of animal consciousness may be an unanswerable one. Scientists and philosophers cannot agree on how to tell if an animal is conscious or not, because there is no universally agreed upon definition of consciousness. Does consciousness require the ability to think? A computer can think and carry out complex instructions, but is it conscious? Does it know what it is doing, or even that it is? Does it have a sense of self? Does it have a concept of I or me? Does the ability to suffer imply consciousness? If so, how can you identify in an animal that cannot talk what is true suffering and what is just reflexive responses to pain? Recent research produced artificial intelligence that can unconsciously feel pain and be fearful of painful stimuli. So clearly pain and pain avoidance are not the same as consciousness. Artificial intelligence is one thing, but in biology, there are some areas where a scientific consensus exists. There is no disagreement, for example, that mammals are conscious. The behavior, brain, anatomy, and neurochemistry of mammals is all close enough to that of humans that we assume all are conscious, sentient beings that can feel pain and can suffer. Dogs, cats, cows, and pigs are sentient. By that token, rocks, microbes, mushrooms, and plants are not conscious. They have no nervous system or anything remotely like it. There is nothing like to be a plant because there is no self in the plant having any experience there. No thoughts, no emotions, nothing. They don't need them. Even the concept of an individual plant is tenuous. If you take a cutting from a plant, it can sprout roots and grow. Is this a new individual or the same? No, sorry, plants are not conscious and cannot suffer. Just as humans cannot photosynthesize, plants have no need for consciousness. It couldn't help them. They have been doing just fine without it. But what about other animals? How about fish, crabs, insects? Are they conscious? Here, it does become a matter of opinion. The truth is, we don't have a universally agreed upon definition of consciousness. Some scientists argue that insects definitely are conscious, absolutely. Others argue they definitely are not. If you read their papers critically, you see that these different authors are actually using different definitions of consciousness. Under one definition, insects are conscious. Under another definition, they aren't. So where does this leave you? Well, in absence of any universal definition of what consciousness is, you can decide for yourself whether crustaceans or insects have it or not. It's up to you or your country. Already different governments around the world have issued different opinions or even laws about whether or not crustaceans and cephalopods like octopuses are conscious, with laws, for example, forbidding putting a live crab or lobster into boiling water. With time, maybe insects too will be covered by such laws, at least for cooking, in wealthy countries that can afford to care about such things. Current guidelines on using invertebrates for science research state that it is best to act with the assumption that insects can feel and suffer from pain, and to minimize this suffering whenever possible. We'll get to what that means for the insect farmer and the insect chef in another lecture. Putting aside questions of disgust and sustainability, there are several reasons people may have ethical objections to farming insects as food. Many are due to the issue of scale. Insects are tiny. To produce the same amount of meat you'd get from one cow requires thousands of crickets. If you had to choose between killing one mammal or killing many, many insects, which would you choose, and why? Some would argue that even if there is evidence that insects are not conscious, we can never be absolutely certain of this the way we are certain that plants are not conscious, and so it is better not to farm them at all. The problem with this argument is it assumes that not farming insects is the same as not killing them. That's not the case. With very few exceptions, when you eat plants, you are complicit in the killing of insects. Pesticides, lethal traps, natural predators, all are going to be involved in keeping those plants pest-free. In addition, when those crops get harvested, a large number of mammals like rabbits and mice, organisms that we know are conscious, will get slaughtered by accident. Since the protein you get from insects is much more than what you get from plants, then eating insect meat actually minimizes the number of conscious beings that die. This assumes the insects are farmed on wastes, meaning no new plants need to be farmed to produce them, which is not necessarily the case. How many insects actually die during regular agriculture? This number ranges widely, but it's probably higher than you think. For now, let's make an assumption. A single acre of crops has 100 million insects living there, which for some crops is honestly an underestimate. Now, most people probably don't think the death of one insect is equivalent to, say, the death of a human, or even a mouse. So let's use our confidence that an organism is sentient as a metric for how likely they are worth our moral consideration. If we are, let's say, 1% confident that insects are as sentient as humans, and if we assume that pest control kills 80% of insects, then this means an acre of crops will cause about 800,000 expected deaths. Now let's compare insect farming to plant farming. A single acre of soy plants can make about 1,300 kilograms of soybeans. A single mealworm weighs about 100 milligrams. So to get the same amount of food as an acre of soybeans, you need to farm 13 million mealworms. Less than the 100 million that lived on that acre. Account for 1% likelihood of sentience, and you get 130,000 expected deaths. Now, mealworms have more protein in them than soy, but even without that, the math suggests insect farming causes less insect deaths than farming plant protein, if the mealworms are fed recycled grains like spent grains or corn mash. If we have to raise plants to feed the insects, then the math changes in favor of the plants. There's another ethical dimension regarding farming, which is the idea of net negative lives. It states that while bringing a cow, a chicken, or a cricket to life seems noble, if that life is going to be spent in suffering, then it was not ethical to bring it about in the first place. This is the reason why most vegans see having pets as okay, but industrial agriculture with animals kept in tight enclosures, unable to carry out normal behavior, is wrong. Pets hopefully live net positive lives, while the life of a farmed cow or chicken, or even a farmed crab, is unfortunately quite terrible. This argument does not work for insects, however, even if we assume that they have the emotions to suffer from bad conditions. The reason is that the conditions most insects like are crowded, hot, and filthy. Think of the messiest, most disgusting conditions you would never want to live in, and you can probably imagine cockroaches and houseflies having an absolute party in them. Mealworms actually grow better in crowded conditions. Their immune system becomes stronger at high densities, and they are attracted to the smells of each other's wastes. Plus, life on a farm for an insect is typically much easier than life in the field. Ample food, no predators hunting you, no parasitoids laying eggs in you. If insects live longer, healthier lives on a farm than in nature, with a higher survival rate, then who is to say their lives are not positive? As always, which of these arguments you agree with is up to you. Some people may never agree that eating any animal is okay. Others might decide that, out of all the animals, insects are acceptable. This would be the entovegan, one who doesn't eat animal protein except for insects. Entovegans are similar to ostrovegans or bivalve vegans, people who won't eat meat or milk but will eat clams and oysters because bivalves have no brain and so are unlikely to suffer. If you consider the possibility that insect farming on waste can reduce the carbon footprints of the food we already eat, can be a source of money for poor farmers, and other economic and environmental factors, then you may even decide that eating insects is a moral good, that it would be unethical not to eat insects if given the opportunity. Food, like ethics, is a personal matter, so I won't tell you here what is right or wrong. Vegetarian, vegan, carnivore, insect eater, the choice is yours.